This season of the Cold Podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please, take care in listening. The world had gone into lockdown. COVID-19 had exploded into a full-blown pandemic. Schools and businesses were shuttered. Streets in cities across the United States were eerily quiet. It was the spring of 2020, but at least one business in Ogden, Utah, remained open. Dave Moore's sewing machine repair shop. Dave and his brother, who co-owned the business, were trying to keep up with a sudden surge in demand for their services.
We were extremely busy when COVID broke out because everyone was staying home making masks.
Dave's shop is still located right where it had been in October of 1985, on the night when Sheree Warren had disappeared. The bar on the other side of the parking lot, where Dave had gone for a drink with his friend Cary Hartman that night, was still there too, but it had changed names and owners several times over the decades. There's a small office tucked in the back of Dave's shop. Dave was working in the office one day that spring of 2020 when he heard someone come through the door onto the sales floor.
My brother was down on the floor, and Cary came in, and my brother's not real fond of Cary. Said, let me see if he'll see you. So he came up, and I just walked down real briefly, said, hi, what are you doing? And he basically gave me the story that he was living in a halfway house, and somebody donated a bed and a small TV to him, and that was basically the conversation.
A modest new beginning for Kerry Hartman. Cary had just returned to Ogden after spending 32 years in prison. Dave had struggled over those years to reconcile the charming Cary he had once known with the secretive man Cary had revealed himself to be.
To be honest with you, I didn't believe he did it until he was convicted.
They'd remained in contact for a while, but fell out of touch during the 90s. Years later, Dave wrote a letter to Cary.
Just to see how he was doing, just to see what the situation was. And I basically wanted to know, what's wrong with you,
Cary had not responded. So when Cary dropped in unannounced on Dave at work in early 2020, Dave hadn't felt too eager to renew their old friendship.
Yeah, we both changed.
Cary and Dave had been together at the bar on the evening of Sheree Warren's disappearance, almost 35 years earlier. Cary had tried to use Dave as an alibi. So it's interesting one of the first things Cary did after getting out of prison was check up on his old friend. Cary had told the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole before leaving prison he had anticipated a tough transition.
I know there's going to be rejection when I go out there in one form or another. Now, when I can't handle that, that's a risky situation for me. I know who I can call to say, whoa, my self-esteem is in the dirt.
I wonder if Cary's self-esteem took a hit when he realized he could no longer count Dave Moore as a friend. Another old friend of Cary's, Brent Morgan, the taxidermist, told me he also wants nothing to do with Cary, which is saying something, because Brent and Cary grew up together.
If you go back to friends, I can remember him the farthest back because of the association of my parents and his parents.
Cary had written letters to Brent's mom for years after his conviction, and Cary's own mother, Donna Hartman, had kept in touch with the Morgans as well.
Donna was always after Mom and myself to go and visit him. And there was a couple of times I thought about it and I just didn't want to. Didn't want to.
Cary's mom, Donna Hartman, had attended her son's parole board hearings. She had heard him say under oath he had lied to his family about being innocent.
I was in denial. I couldn't face up to what I had done. I was racked with guilt and shame.
But Brent Morgan told me Cary had privately held to a different story. He hadn't raped anyone and was only admitting to the crimes because otherwise the parole board would never let him out of prison. Donna Hartman died in 2013.
His mother went to her grave believing that he was innocent.
Cary's dad, Bill Hartman, had defended his son from the start. He had paid Cary's bail, put up his own money to fund DNA testing, and also attended his son's parole board hearings. But Bill Hartman didn't live to see Cary regain his freedom either. Bill died in January of 2020, just 2 months shy of Cary's release from prison. Sheree Warren's friend and former coworker, Pam Volk, hadn't realized Cary was free when she and I met a year and a half later.
Is he out?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know he was out.
Yeah.
That honestly makes me a little nervous. Okay, well, interesting. And he lives in Ogden?
Yeah, he does. I know, because I paid Cary Hartman a visit myself. This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 10. Last Man Standing. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. Sheree Warren's dad, Ed Sorensen, told Salt Lake City TV station KTVX in 2019 he hoped to someday learn what happened to Sheree.
Sure, I'd love to know what happened. But I don't think we'll ever find out.
Roy City Police were at the time actively investigating Sheree's disappearance. The cold case remained in the hands of Detective John Frawley, who still has the case today. John told me meeting Sheree's family had changed his perspective.
Kind of sobering feeling that this family, they didn't get any answers.
Those conversations were driving John and his fellow detectives to keep digging. They wanted to at last be able to tell Sheree's dad, Ed Sorensen, they were bringing his daughter home.
I don't know how to explain that other than we want answers just as much as anyone else. It's important to us.
John had come to believe Kerry Hartman held those answers, and he had wanted to ask Kerry about it.
I went down to the prison twice, and then I met with him at AP&P, so 3 times.
AP&P is short for Adult Probation and Parole. It's a state agency in Utah responsible for supervising people after they are released from prison. John told me these interactions with Kerry hadn't proved very fruitful.
You know, I've been in a room with some interesting people during this career, and he's one of them. It's just very different.
We've heard several people over the course of this season describe Kerry as having 2 personalities. He could come across as debonair or devilish, depending on the moment. John didn't tell me which Kerry he encountered. Kerry's release hadn't come without strings. He had to abide by conditions set by the parole board.
As part of his parole agreement, he was mandated to submit to random polygraph.
A lie detector, about whatever police wanted to ask him about. Random polygraphs are a standard condition of parole in felony sex offense cases in Utah. The results aren't typically admissible as evidence in court, but they can help investigators figure out if they are on the right track. Cary Hartman had never taken a lie detector test about his relationship with Sheree Warren. He might end up back in prison on a parole violation if he refused to cooperate now. John Frawley had Cary in a corner.
Oh man, yeah, he's not happy with me.
John called in an FBI agent with decades of experience as a polygraph examiner. The agent sat Cary down and asked him a series of questions about Sheree's disappearance.
And he did fail that polygraph test.
Spectacularly, or so I have heard. Roy police have refused to give me any records related to the polygraph. The FBI won't even acknowledge such a report exists, which would be comical if it wasn't so frustrating. This put John in something of a tight spot. He's told me the polygraph report is important, but he's also not at liberty to discuss it in detail. He could only give me this 3-word summary without getting into trouble.
It shows deception.
Cary's performance at the polygraph went so poorly, it made John rethink his entire take on the Sheree Warren case. From that point forward, he no longer saw Chuck Warren as his prime suspect. I asked John, if that was so, why hadn't he just arrested Cary?
It doesn't give me what I need because I have 2 persons of interest.
Chuck Warren's unwillingness or inability to provide a clear story about where he had been after Sheree disappeared meant John couldn't completely count Chuck out.
Yep, the two persons of interest are still Charles Warren and Cary Hartman.
Chuck Warren never showed much interest in what had happened to his estranged wife Sheree in 1985. He had just moved on with his life. In the last episode, we heard Roy Police Detective John Frawley's 2015 interview with Chuck.
You say you can't remember too much, but you're doing pretty good. You remember.
As you're bringing it up, I can remember a few things.
John had asked Chuck about Cary Hartman.
Did you know about him at the time? I mean, did you know that she was dating him, or?
I can't remember.
Can't remember that.
I just can't remember.
Okay.
When he got arrested, it seemed like, then I heard something about that she'd been dating.
That she had been dating. After.
I think that's how I found out, but I don't know.
After.
She never said anything to me about it.
Okay.
And I never asked her that.
Right.
Because I was dating a lot of girls at the time.
Right.
In case you didn't catch that, Chuck said he had been dating a lot of girls when Sheree had disappeared. But we also know Chuck had reunited with his first wife Alice during that same period. By the time of John Frawley's interview with Chuck, 30 years later, Chuck was living with his third wife, a woman named Willow. She had sat by Chuck's side while John questioned him. Willow had interjected at one point, saying she wasn't surprised to hear Chuck had acted unconcerned when Sheree didn't show up looking for her son on the night of her disappearance.
He's been a pretty easygoing guy too, so when she didn't actually come pick him up at that time, he probably wasn't too worried about it. She'd be there eventually.
The first time I heard this audio recording, I thought Chuck and Willow shared an odd dynamic. Chuck and Willow had lived together for about 10 years, but had only been married a year or so at the time of the interview. And they didn't stay married long. 3 years later, in 2018, Chuck filed for divorce. Court records show Willow tried to lay claim to a lot of Chuck's property, including stuff he had bought well before they had married. Willow also refused to move out of Chuck's house. He twice filed eviction lawsuits against her. She left under protest in early 2020, but didn't stay gone. Willow soon convinced her ex-husband, Chuck, to let her back into his heart, his life, and his house. You might be wondering who you're supposed to root for in all this. Neither Chuck nor Willow seem very sympathetic. But there's a revelation I found in the court records that puts their squabble in a different context. Chuck filed a third eviction lawsuit against Willow in September of 2020. It says, quote, "Willow was supposed to help Chuck as he had been diagnosed with dementia. Willow has not been giving Chuck his medications." Looking back, the beginnings of Chuck's mental decline seemed apparent 5 years earlier, during his interview with Detective John Frawley.
Well, I have trouble remembering how to say different words.
In the last episode, I told you how Willow was 27 years younger than Chuck. They had met and moved in together years before the onset of Chuck's memory problems.
He never used to be like this. How do I do this? How do I do that? And I get frustrated with it.
But Willow had only married Chuck in a spur-of-the-moment Las Vegas Elvis Chapel wedding after Chuck's memory started failing. Willow Hendricks went to court herself. She asked a judge to appoint her as Chuck Warren's legal guardian. That hadn't sat well with Chuck's brother and 2 sons, one of whom was also Sheree's son. Court records show they intervened, trying to block Willow from taking control of Chuck's assets. On February 1st, 2021, a judge declared Chuck incapacitated. Under the legal definition, that meant Chuck could no longer provide for his own protection, health, or safety. His ability to evaluate information, make decisions, and provide for the necessities of life were impaired. Chuck's dementia meant whatever he might have known about Sheree's disappearance was locked away where even he couldn't get to it. And if evidence were to somehow emerge proving Chuck had killed Sheree, no prosecutor would ever charge him. Chuck wouldn't be able to aid in his own defense or even understand what he was accused of doing. I learned about Chuck's condition early in my research for this season. I realized I wouldn't ever have a chance to interview him. I couldn't, in good conscience, knowing Chuck lacked the cognitive ability to understand the questions I would ask. And it's a terrible, lost opportunity. From February of 2021 onward, Chuck Warren was off limits in the search for answers about Sheree's disappearance. A couple of months later, in April of 2021, an investigator for the Weber County Attorney's Office brought Cary Hartmann to an office in downtown Ogden. The investigator, Steve Haney, introduced Cary to a criminal defense lawyer named Michael Bowis. Michael was a public defender who had represented thousands of clients over the years. Haney had called both Cary and Michael here as part of a plan he had conceived. He hoped he might coax Cary into admitting to Sheree Warren's murder by making Cary an offer he couldn't refuse. What I tell you next has never before been revealed. Steve Haney, the investigator, handed Cary a letter from the county attorney. It offered Cary immunity from criminal charges if he revealed the location of Sheree Warren's remains. A promise. Take us to Sheree and we won't charge you with her murder. This is what's known as transactional immunity. It's sometimes used to obtain testimony from witnesses or accomplices. See Season 2 of this podcast for an example. But it's almost never provided to the primary target in a major criminal investigation like this. The wording of the immunity offer was broad. There were no hidden gotchas. It was a literal get-out-of-jail-free card for Cary Hartman. The letter even said this promise of immunity did not depend on the successful recovery of Sheree's remains. So long as Cary told the truth about what he had done and made a good faith effort to show where he had left her body, he wouldn't face any consequences. The county attorney had already signed the letter. All it needed to become binding was Cary's own signature. Cary, I'm told, seemed suspicious and skeptical. He didn't know Michael Bowis, this lawyer the cop Haney said was supposed to represent him. Besides, Cary said he already had his own lawyer, a fact Haney hadn't realized. Cary called his attorney on the phone. They talked, then informed investigator Steve Haney they needed time to discuss the offer. Cary then left, taking the immunity letter with him. About a week later, Steve Haney received a follow-up call from Cary's attorney. The lawyer reportedly said Cary was not going to accept the immunity offer. But here's the thing. As far as I know, Cary still has the immunity letter, and he could at any time sign it, walk into the Weber County Attorney's office, admit to killing Sheree Warren, and face no consequences. But maybe Cary doesn't need to do that. After all, why would he need immunity for something he's insisted he didn't do? Maybe Cary just doesn't like talking to cops. Perhaps he would feel more comfortable speaking with a reporter. Let's find out. The air feels stifling. I sit in the driver's seat of a small Honda crossover, pulled into a parking stall at an apartment complex not far from the mouth of Ogden Canyon. It's the same place where Cary Hartman lived at the time of his arrest in 1987. It's the apartment complex where police had found a gray suede jacket, possibly belonging to Sheree Warren, when they had searched Cary's unit in the rape investigation. For some reason, Cary Hartman chose to move back here in 2020 after he left prison, following a short stint at a halfway house. I step out of the car and walk toward one of the 3-story buildings. It's the start of May 2021, and Utah's experiencing a spring swelter. Air conditioners whir as I pass by. I look at the numbers on the doors, counting up until I find the right one, stop, and knock. No answer. I look at the unit number again, comparing it to Cary's public listing in the Utah Sex Offender Registry. It's the right place, I'm sure. But Cary doesn't seem to be home, or at least he doesn't answer the door. I expected this, and I've come prepared with a pen and notepad.
Okay, what is our date today?
It's the 5th, Cinco de Mayo.
That's the voice of my boss, Sheryl Worsley, who's joining me on this outing.
All right, let's see, what do we want to say here? Mr. Cary Hartman.
This isn't the first letter I've written to Cary. I'd reached out to him once before, when he was still incarcerated. At that time, I was researching the murder of Joyce Yost for season 2 of this podcast. I had come across the recording of William Babel, aka Charlie, the FBI informant. We heard from him back in episode 6.
I was in a therapy group with Cary Hartman, and I know Cary Hartman's story very well.
William Babel had told the FBI Cary Hartman killed Sheree Warren. But Babel later switched up his story and told a South Ogden police detective a different guy, Doug Lovell, killed Sheree.
He was afraid he was going to get questioned in a rape, kidnap, murder of somebody named Sheree Warren.
I had wanted to know what Cary made of Babel's contradictory claims. Was William Babel a liar? But Cary never responded to my first letter. So this is why I'm standing at Cary's door. I'm carrying a transcript of the William Babel police interview with me as I knock at Cary's apartment. When he doesn't answer, I tuck the transcript behind his screen door, along with the following note.
Mr. Cary Hartman, my name is Dave Cawley. I'm a reporter with KSL. I previously wrote you while you were still incarcerated, hoping to set up an interview regarding a story I was working on about the Joyce Yost case. I never heard back, but would still like an opportunity to speak with you. I will be publishing a story next week that includes a claim Doug Lovell had some involvement with the disappearance of another woman whom you knew, Sheree Warren. I've included a copy of a police interview with a prison informant named William Babel. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what William had to say. Look forward to hearing from you, Dave Cawley.
There you go.
So be it.
Then Sheryl and I walk back to our car and crank up the AC. I'm about to put the car in reverse when I glance at the rearview mirror and freeze. Act cool, I say to Sheryl, but take a look to our left. As she does, I reach down and switch off the ignition.
So we're sitting in the car outside Cary Hartman's apartment, having just left a note in his door telling him that we wanted to speak with him. And Sheryl, what happened?
And he pulls up, backs into a parking spot, and we're like, we think that's him.
Yeah, I recognized the car driving past in the rear view being a Chevy Avalanche, which is what was listed as one of his vehicles on the Utah Sex Offender Registry, and you watched him get out.
Yep, it looks like it's him. So we're gonna give him a second to get our note, and we'll try again.
Give him a door knock.
Yep.
We decide 5 minutes seems fair, enough time to read the letter and skim the transcript. We wait, watching the clock, then go knock on Cary Hartman's door a second time. The door opens just a crack. I can see the lights are off inside. It's dark, cave-like, as if blackout curtains cover all the windows. But enough light shines through the crack in the door to illuminate a face I recognize in the shadows.
Hey, Cary. Dave Cawley from KSL. I left you a note, but then I saw you pulling in as we were getting ready to leave. Can I talk to you for just a second?
No, I don't have anything to say.
Okay.
If you want to talk to me, I'll talk to you.
Oh, who's your attorney? I'd be happy to reach out.
Jonathan Porter's my attorney.
Jonathan Porter? Okay, thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Got it.
And that's the entirety of my communication with Cary Hartman. It struck me as odd Cary referred me to his attorney. At the time, I wasn't aware Weber County had offered Cary immunity just a couple of weeks earlier. I did reach out to Cary's attorney, by the way, but I received no response. Cary Hartman won't talk to me. I did talk to former Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman, the guy who had made the rape case against Cary in 1987, around the same time I went to knock on Cary Hartman's door. Zimmerman told me he believes Cary's paid his debt to society and deserves a chance to prove he is a changed man. Zimmerman's position surprised me. He's not someone I expected would show Cary much sympathy. Zimmerman's notes and reports include a lot of detail about what Cary reportedly did to his suspected victims back in the 80s. I haven't shared all of what's in them, mostly to avoid being salacious and to protect the innocent from additional trauma. Zimmerman declined my request for an on-the-record interview, but I shared what he told me with former Roy Police Detective Jack Bell, the original investigator on Sheree Warren's disappearance.
What Zimmerman said about him doing his time is true, because he has done more time for the rapes than he would for a manslaughter.
Cary had spent 32 years in prison, more than double the 15-year minimum on his sentence. Over the course of this season, we've heard how the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole kept Cary in for a few reasons. They included Cary's own refusal to accept responsibility for what he had done.
There is tremendous repression and denial going on, so strongly that therapy would be completely a waste of time until there's a change of your perception.
The parole board had at times feared Cary might revert to his past behaviors. And there was the matter of Cary's possible involvement in the disappearance of Sheree Warren. But in the end, the parole board decided to send Cary back out into society. Jack Bell told me he doesn't believe Cary Hartman's squared his debts.
No, I don't feel like he's done his time.
I also asked former Weber County Attorney Reed Richards, the prosecutor who had first put Cary away, if he believes Cary's paid his debts.
Well, that's an interesting discussion, and I don't know that I have an opinion on it.
Reed said he had felt surprised. Not that the parole board let Cary out, but instead that it kept Cary in as long as it did.
Why so? Well, because it was 15 to life. So generally, people were doing 15 years and getting out. But I can say that if he had been convicted at the same time of homicide and the rape cases, he probably wouldn't have spent any more time than he spent.
You could make an argument Cary's already received punishment for a crime he's not been charged with. Would that mean Cary no longer bears responsibility if he killed Sheree Warren?
And I guess the other question is, what would a court do with it anyway? You know, if you were to convict him now, he's probably, 75 or so?
Cary is 74 years old at the time I'm recording this.
Yeah, so what are they going to do with him?
If prosecutors today charged Cary Hartman with Sheree Warren's murder based on the evidence at hand, and if that case went to trial and you ended up on the jury, odds are you wouldn't hear a word about lingerie survey phone calls, the Ogden City rapist investigation, or the lies Cary told the parole board over the years. Courts operate under rules of evidence. Those rules spell out what kind of information prosecutors can use to try and prove their case. The stuff I just mentioned would likely not be allowed because it doesn't directly tie into Sheree Warren's disappearance. And even if it did, a judge might still not allow it because of the risk it could prejudice the jury against Cary. This explains why the Weber County Attorney's Office offered Cary Hartman immunity. They were willing to give up on ever charging Cary if it meant they might recover Sheree's remains for her family.
Like with any person who's lost a loved one, to have the body and know where the grave is pretty important. So yeah, I think there's value in doing that, even if you don't prosecute.
But as we heard, Cary rejected the immunity offer.
I'm not sure where you go at this point, unless you find the body somewhere. And even if you find the body, that doesn't necessarily tell you who killed her.
That would depend on where. We have two likely suspects, Chuck Warren or Cary Hartman. Finding Sheree Warren's remains somewhere in the desert partway between Ogden and Las Vegas wouldn't directly tie her death to either of them. On the other hand, finding Sheree's remains buried in the backyard of Chuck's house would clearly point toward him. Finding her remains on the mountain behind Cawley Reservoir would point to Cary. Most of my attention has so far focused on Cawley because we have a confluence of evidence all pointing that direction. It's near where Cary Hartman lured Heidi Posnine at the start of our story. It's where his friends owned land and liked to hunt. It's where the elk hunting guide, Fred Johns, spotted Cary 4 days after Sheree disappeared. And it's where an anonymous caller reported finding a woman's body.
I'm reporting a body that I found.
Remains that to this day have not been located. Let's imagine that changed. Pretend somebody found Sheree's remains on the mountain behind Cawley, where the elk hunting guide cited Cary Hartmann. How would we then interpret everything we have learned so far this season? I'm now going to walk you through a step-by-step of what Sheree Warren's murder could have looked like, based on the evidence and witness testimony we have gathered. There are gaps, which I will bridge with some speculation. Keep in mind, I'm not saying this is what did happen. I am saying it's one possible explanation of what could have happened. On the evening of October 2nd, 1985, Sheree Warren walked out of an office building in Salt Lake City. She told Richard Moss, the man she'd been training, she was headed to Wagstaff Toyota to pick up her estranged husband.
It was about 6:25 that we finally balanced and left the office. We got to the parking lot. She went to the west, I went north.
But Sheree's husband, Chuck Warren, wasn't waiting for her at Wagstaff. He had changed his plans at the last minute and decided not to take his Toyota Supra from his home in Ogden to the dealership in Salt Lake City.
I remember calling her to tell her I wasn't coming.
Around that same time, Kerry Hartman dropped in at his friend Dave Moore's shop in Ogden. Kerry suggested they go grab a couple drinks at a bar across the way. Kerry and Dave spent a couple hours at the bar, from about 6 to between 8 and 9 p.m. So Kerry was at the bar when Sheree left her work 40 miles south in Salt Lake City. Sheree would have headed toward Ogden, either straight from work or after realizing Chuck wasn't waiting for her at Wagstaff Toyota. Given the drive time, Sheree would have arrived in the Ogden area around 7:30 p.m. at the earliest. Her daily routine was to meet Chuck at the Denny's restaurant just off the I-15 freeway in Roy. But she had been late getting out of work, so I don't know if she would have gone there or not on this particular night. She didn't have a cell phone, making it difficult to change plans on the fly. Chuck wasn't at that Denny's in any case. He later told police he had gone out for that jog.
Yeah, I was out jogging. That's what I was doing.
Maybe Sheree stopped at the Denny's in Roy looking for Chuck. We know she didn't go home because her mom, Mary Sorensen, said Sheree never showed up for dinner. Everything I have heard about Sheree suggests her top priority would have been picking up her son, so I believe she would have headed toward Chuck's house. If you today ask your phone for directions from Roy to Chuck's house in Ogden, it will route you up Ogden's 7th Street. That's where Cary Hartman lived at the time. Give a little more drive time to get from Roy to Ogden, and we see Sheree could have driven past Cary's basement apartment around 8 p.m. or a little after. That's around the same time Cary's friend Dave Moore told me they had left the bar, meaning Cary could have already been home by the time Sheree, hypothetically, drove past his place. She could have seen his yellow truck parked in the driveway at the top of the stairs that lead down into the basement. The two women who had lived above Cary, the teachers Kaylin and Mary, later told police they believed Sheree had stopped there that night. They told Detective John Frawley they had overheard a loud argument.
And the argument was Sheree had found out Cary Hartman was dating someone else. And during this argument, they heard a loud thud. And then Cary Hartman cusses, and then they don't hear anything after that.
Cary had a history of using physical force against his romantic partners. He outweighed Sheree by at least 50 pounds. It's possible a single blow could have knocked her unconscious or even killed her. I can imagine Cary then in a panic, wondering who else knew Sheree was at his place. Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, told police Cary had called her around 8 p.m. Cary had asked where Sheree was. She told Cary Sheree had intended to meet Chuck at the car dealership, then come home for dinner. But Sheree hadn't showed up yet. As far as we know, Mary didn't say anything to Cary about Sheree having plans to stop off at Cary's apartment that night. So Cary would have presumably known he was safe, at least for a little while. After hanging up with Mary, Cary could have wrapped Sheree in his black parka before taking her up the stairs from the basement apartment and placing her in his truck. Where to then? He would have needed somewhere dark and remote. Maybe Lost Creek, where Cary had spent time deer hunting with his brother and cop buddies in the past. Lost Creek was an hour-and-a-half drive away, most of it on the interstate. Too far and too risky. How about Cawley? The secluded confines of Cawley Estates were only 45 minutes from Ogden. The route, along Utah State Highway 39, wound through dark canyons. And Cary knew his way around Cawley Estates. He had spent time there with friends, like the taxidermist Brent Morgan.
There was a locked gate.
Brent just happened to have loaned Cary his key to the gate at Cawley Estates a couple of weeks earlier.
Once he's past the gate to get into Cawley Estates, he can go up top.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
There is no proof Cary visited Cawley Estates on the night of Sheree's disappearance. This is speculative, and you should treat what I say here with due skepticism. I don't think it's likely Cary would have spent too long at Cawley Estates if he had gone there that night. It's not likely he would have gone all the way up the mountain, because in this hypothetical scenario, Sheree's car would have still been sitting on the street outside his place in Ogden. Every second it remained there, he would have been exposed. He would have needed a quick but safe drop site.
The thing you got to understand about Cary is he's lazy. He's not going to do anything that's too hard.
Cary had spent the first part of that evening at the bar with his friend Dave Moore, and Dave had owned a lot in Cawley Estates at the time.
Pretty quiet back in those days?
It was real quiet.
Cary would have known Dave's lot at Cawley Estates was unoccupied that night, making it a safe place to temporarily stash Sheree. Cary could have driven from his apartment in Ogden to Dave Moore's lot in Cawley Estates and been back home before 11 p.m. Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, told police she had received a second call from Cary on the night of Sheree's disappearance between 10 and 11. He had again asked if Sheree had made it home. Mary had said no. In this hypothetical scenario, Cary could have made this second call to Mary Sorensen after returning from dropping Sheree's body, using it to bolster his story. He hadn't seen Sheree at all that night. Next, Cary would have needed to get rid of Sheree's car. He would have taken her keys and gone out to her Toyota Corolla. Chuck Warren liked to go to Las Vegas. He had honeymooned there more than once. His brother told me Chuck had gone to Vegas regularly. It seems plausible Sheree might have shared that detail with Cary. If so, it's conceivable Cary might have chosen to take Sheree's car to Vegas as part of an effort to frame Chuck. If Cary had driven through the night, he could have arrived in Las Vegas just before sunrise. A quick jog to the airport, a false name at the ticket counter, and a breeze through the pre-9/11 security process could have put Cary on a plane and back in Salt Lake City by 9:30 a.m. He would have then needed to get from Salt Lake to Ogden. A taxicab's one possibility, but I don't think someone sneaking home from dumping murder evidence in another state would want to leave a random cab driver as a witness if it could be avoided. A trusted friend or relative seems more likely to me, but to my knowledge, no one's ever come forward to say they picked Cary up at the airport. That's one major hole in this hypothetical scenario. Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, reported her daughter missing to Roy police around noon on October 3rd, the day after Sheree's disappearance. Her report landed on the desk of Detective Jack Bell. Jack had first tried to get a hold of Chuck Warren, but couldn't find him. Jack had then turned his attention to Cary, placing a call to Cary around 2:30 p.m. Cary would later claim he called Jack, not the other way around. Cary said he made that call from work, but his time card told a different story. It said Cary had taken that day off. In any case, Cary had arrived at Roy Police Headquarters around 2:45. He had told Jack he had gone to the bar with his friend, Dave Moore, the prior evening. Cary had said he hadn't realized Sheree was missing until that morning, when he had supposedly talked to her mom on the phone. This contradicted what Mary Sorensen described about getting 2 phone calls from Cary the night prior. In this first interaction between Cary Hartman and Jack Bell, Cary didn't say Sheree was supposed to be waiting for him at his basement apartment while Cary was at the bar. That implausible story came later. The first newspaper report of Sheree's disappearance published the next day, Friday, 2 days after Sheree was last seen leaving her work. Cary's upstairs neighbors saw the article and recalled the loud fight they had heard. One of them, Mary, taped a sympathy note to Cary's door. Cary responded by grilling Mary about whether she had seen Sheree at the house at any point during the last couple days.
He had been so convincing about how he felt about losing her.
Those are Mary's words from her written statement, read by a voice actor.
He told us at that time that he was sure it was her ex-husband.
The next day, on Saturday, 3 days after Sheree was last seen, Cary dropped by the home of his TV reporter friend, Larry Lewis. He asked Larry to go on a three-wheeler ride looking for Sheree's body. They had taken the three-wheelers into the foothills above the city. Larry would later say Cary had said they didn't need to look around Chuck Warren's house because police had already done that, which wasn't true. Cary had showed up at gatherings after Sheree disappeared, where her family prayed for her safe return. Detective Shane Miner had talked to people who said Cary had claimed to be spending all his time searching for Sheree and handing out missing persons flyers.
But then the question is he really, or is that just he wants people to believe?
He did pass some of the flyers around to his friends and even his own brother. But remember, Cary's upstairs neighbors ended up finding a full box of those flyers abandoned in his closet after he moved out, a year following Sheree's disappearance.
It seems like that would be pretty common. You would hear one side from Cary on what he's doing, who he's doing it with, and everything they're doing. But then when you talk to the person he's referring to, they describe it as quite a bit different. Like none of that was taking place.
If Cary had left Sheree Warren's body at Cawley Estates on the night of her disappearance, he might have felt nervous in the days that followed as he put on this ruse of searching for her. It was opening weekend of the annual elk hunt. Cary would have known many of the cabin owners of Cawley Estates would be headed up the mountain. Cary might have decided to move Sheree deeper into the back country. It's a theory his former friend, the taxidermist Brent Morgan, told me makes sense.
If he had access up there and could go up and down the roads, you can find the right place where you can 1, 2, 3 heave ho, and it's going to be in a spot where people aren't going to go.
But it's got to be a place that he can
get to.
Hypothetically get a body to, right?
That's exactly right. And there are places up there where roads go to those type of areas. But it's a big area.
Cary at this time still possessed the key for the gate at Cawley Estates he had borrowed from Brent. Back in episode 4, Brent told us he had tried to get his key back, but Cary had dodged him for days, not wanting to return it. So Cary could have gone back to Cawley Estates early on Sunday, October 6th, 4 days after Sheree disappeared, with his ugly yellow truck and another man. A man who resembled his younger brother, Jack. Because this is when the elk hunting guide Fred Johns would later say he saw Cary Hartman trespassing on private property. Cary could have retrieved Sheree's body from Cawley Estates and driven farther up onto the mountain behind Cawley, to the middle of nowhere. Cary might have backed his truck into some trees off the side of the primitive dirt road. It would have provided cover as he transferred his payload from the back of his truck to one of his three-wheelers. From there, Cary might have gone off into the brush until he found a protected, private place to once again abandon Sheree's body, this time for good. Back in episode 4, we met a former Weber County Sheriff's detective named Rod Layton. He had led the search for the anonymous caller who had reported finding a body near Cawley.
I was a lieutenant over Investigations Division when I left.
Rod told me, in his experience, most crimes, and most criminals, are not complicated.
Don't give these people more credit than they deserve for being smart or being motivated, because they're not.
Rod said this same logic applies to killers who try to cover their crime by concealing the victim's body. They tend to act irrationally, out of fear.
And they're not smart, and they're lazy.
This assumption is common in law enforcement circles, and for good reason. It keeps investigators from wasting time on fantastical theories. Keep it simple.
Do I think that this guy went up there, carried the body back a mile? No.
But the assumption might break down if your suspected killer is a person who knows this is how cops tend to think. A person with police training. A person who knows to take that one bit of extra effort. So I'm going to challenge Rod's assumption here, because evidence suggests Cary Hartman had the training, the means, and the mindset to be an exception to the rule. We've now explored a hypothetical scenario involving Cary killing Sheree, then later enlisting the help of an accomplice to move Sheree's body to a place it wouldn't be found on the mountain behind Cawley. Moving a body is not a trivial task. I wasn't sure if the three-wheeled ATVs Cary owned in 1985 would have been up to the job. If the answer is no, the whole hypothetical falls apart. If the answer is yes, it suggests Sheree's remains could be on that mountain today, in a place where no one's yet bothered to look. I decided to buy a three-wheeler and conduct an experiment. I wanted to know if it was feasible for someone to use a machine like the ones Cary Hartman had owned to move a body off-road into the backcountry behind Cawley. But first, some context.
It takes two wheels to have some fun.
Three-wheeled ATVs first hit the market at the start of the 70s. By the 80s, they were exploding in popularity.
Just try the Honda ATC.
11 years ago, Honda invented the ATC three-wheeler. And ever since, folks have been inventing new ways to use it.
Many hunters today will quarter a deer and haul it out of the forest on a four-wheeler. But I didn't know if that would have been so simple with a more primitive three-wheeler. Vintage three-wheelers are narrower, way less, and are more maneuverable than four-wheelers. People took them everywhere, cutting new trails and ripping up vegetation.
It's mainly the small all-terrain cycles, or ATCs, that are at the heart of the problem. Popular with kids and adults alike, they're fun to ride and go almost anywhere. They're also dangerous.
Most three-wheelers didn't have suspension, meaning they couldn't carry as much weight and were rough to ride. They also had a tendency to tip or roll, causing injuries or even death. That's why manufacturers stopped making them in 1987, but you can still buy old ones secondhand, which is what I did. Former South Ogden Police Detective Terry Carpenter, who I met while working on the Joyce Yost case in Season 2 of this podcast, was able to secure permission for me to access the private land on the mountain between Cawley and Lost Creek reservoirs, the slash in the % sign. Terry and I met at Lost Creek one morning in July of 2022. I unrolled a large map of the area across the tailgate of Terry's truck.
So we're gonna come up Kilfoyle all the way up to the corral, right?
Right.
Then we're gonna hang a left.
Our target established, we headed up the mountain. Terry had the key to open the gate. It was a long ride, nearly 15 miles one way from Lost Creek. We came to the spot on the mountain where Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had told police he saw Cary Hartman and another man, possibly Cary's younger brother Jack, on the Sunday after Sheree Warren disappeared. Terry Carpenter and I stepped out into the clearing on the ridge. Standing there in the summer sun, I tried to imagine what reason Cary might have had for coming to this isolated spot 4 days after his girlfriend vanished. He had reportedly told Fred Johns, the hunting guide, he was looking for elk. But as we have heard from Cary's own brother...
What did he hunt, to the best of your present recollection? Just deer? Just deer.
So was Cary stalking elk, or had he harbored more sinister intentions? To test whether an old three-wheeler could have carried a human body from this roadside clearing deeper into the forest, I needed an object similar in size, shape, and weight. I pulled 3 bags of rock salt out of Terry's truck. Each one weighed 40 pounds. I spread a set of painter's coveralls on the dirt, then poured the 120 pounds of rock salt into the coveralls through a zippered opening on the chest. Sheree's driver's license listed her as 5'5" and 115 pounds.
So this is about as much as a human body would weigh, 120 pounds rock salt. And it is not easy to move.
Terry and I lifted the simulated body onto the rack mounted on the back of my three-wheeler.
1, 2, 3.
I'm a reasonably fit guy, but this task felt more difficult than I had anticipated.
Come around this side. You got it?
Not just because of the weight. The simulated body proved unwieldy.
Okay. That is a two-person job. You are not doing that alone.
I've never moved an actual deceased human body, so I'm not sure how well this approximated reality. But a second set of hands made a huge difference. I'm not sure I could have managed on my own. With the simulated body in place, I fired up the three-wheeler's small engine and headed down the dirt road. Having so much additional weight over the rear axle took pressure off the single front tire, which in turn made steering less effective. The engine felt sluggish. The rear tires rubbed on the plastic fenders, but the frame didn't bottom out, and with enough extra throttle, the three-wheeler did go. I rode about a quarter mile to a place where I knew from my research an old Jeep trail forked off from the road. Maps from the 80s showed that trail descending into a canyon called Pete Nelson Hollow. This was one of the places I believed it was plausible Cary Hartman might have gone on that Sunday so many years ago. It appeared evident the Jeep trail hadn't seen use in a long time. Trees had fallen across the path, and the underbrush had reclaimed the old tire tracks. I decided not to try and ride down it myself because of the risk of getting stuck. Instead, I scouted the old trail on foot.
This would be a pretty tough path to get a three-wheeler down. You could do it, but you would need to be a pretty good rider. And with the extra weight from a body, it would not be a fun ride.
That might have been different in 1985, when the path wasn't so overgrown. The old ATV trail ended at a set of springs, where water rose out of the ground and created a series of murky pools. These springs feed into Cawley Reservoir. They were surrounded by thick fields of a poisonous plant called false hellebore. I crashed through it, finding it so dense I couldn't see down past my own waist.
You might walk by a human body in this kind of environment and be 10 feet away from it and not ever see it.
Emerging on the other side of the hellebore patch, I saw meadows of dandelions and clear views farther down into the canyon. If I had been on the three-wheeler, I could have easily kept riding.
It's hard to describe without being up here and seeing this landscape just how futile it feels if you were trying to find a human body up here.
Still, I found myself getting sucked into the moment. I wanted to abandon my experiment and instead wander, searching for Sheree. I knew the odds of finding anything were slim, but irrational hope sometimes leads the mind astray. What if, I wondered, I just happened across a chip of bone or fragment of cloth, some remnant? But no delusions of grandeur. I hiked back to the three-wheeler with a newfound knowledge of what I had only suspected before. Human remains could easily go undetected in these mountain meadows.
And it's possible, I believe, somebody could have driven a three-wheeler down from the ridge into this opening.
If Cary Hartman killed Sheree Warren, my experiment suggests it's plausible he could have used one of his three-wheelers to move her body into the backcountry on this mountain, beyond where police might bother to look. But maybe there's another explanation for what Cary was doing here 4 days after Sheree Warren disappeared. It's a question I would very much like to ask him. And Cary, if you're listening, you have an open invitation to come give your answer. When I first met former Roy Police Detective Jack Bell, we didn't start off talking about the Sheree Warren case. Instead, Jack opened our conversation by talking about another case I wasn't familiar with from the mid-'80s.
It's a strange story. We had a serial bank robber.
This robber had committed holdups at a few banks and a pharmacy. He was a smooth operator who had worn a suit and trench coat. He didn't make the ignorant mistakes many novice criminals do.
Had a pretty good hunch that this bank robber was an ex-cop or a cop. You know, he knew too much about how we did business.
Detectives hadn't had much to go on, aside from a photo that didn't show the man's face and a brief audio recording of his voice. Jack had began to look and listen suspiciously at his fellow officers. He honed in on one particular guy he often saw working out at the city's gym. One day, Jack made a surreptitious tape recording of this suspect.
Taped this guy and turned it over to the FBI, and their voice comparison said, "Yeah, I think you're on the right track. This sure sounds like it."
Jack had grown more and more certain he had his man, but he had no evidence to support that, just a theory.
Lo and behold,
the guy from the gym was not the bank robber. Jack had been wrong. Hard evidence, including a confession, ended up pointing to a different guy, a former Roy City police officer named Boyd Wilcox.
And his voice was perfect.
I didn't at first understand why Jack wanted me to know about the mistake he'd made in the search for this bank robber, since it was unrelated to the disappearance of Sheree Warren. It wasn't until more than 2 hours later in our conversation, Jack came back to it.
It's like I told you about that bank rob. I mean, I left that gym that day convinced I had the right guy.
Jack was trying to warn me. Be careful about what you think you know. Don't let your theories get too far in front of your facts. The hypothetical scenario we've discussed in this episode probably does that. It requires some assumptions that go beyond the available evidence.
You got to be broad. You can't narrow down unless there's absolutely evidence that somebody is guilty, and it's right there.
But narrow it down is exactly what Jack had done at the start of the Sheree Warren case. He'd focused so much attention on Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, he hadn't seen the subtle signs Cary Hartmann might instead be responsible. Jack and I have talked several more times since our first meeting. He's admitted he loses sleep after each of our conversations.
None of us like to fail, and I feel like I failed.
Jack hadn't at first noticed how Cary's story shifted a little with each retelling.
All Cary's stories about her waiting there for him with candles and wine.
Jack hadn't caught the significance of Cary slipping in references to Sheree staying over at his place in the middle of the week, even though that contradicted what Sheree's parents said about her routine.
He wants everybody to know this is her normal procedure and how much this lady's in love with him, supposedly.
Cary had made repeated references to Sheree wearing his black parka on the morning of her disappearance, but Jack hadn't picked up on the potential significance of that. I'll admit, that one's not super obvious. It hadn't seemed suspicious until police later found a gray suede women's jacket in Cary's apartment. It's the tale of two coats we've discussed multiple times this season, and it leaves Jack wondering what other clues might have slipped under his nose during those critical early days.
What did I miss? What did I miss? What did I miss? How many times have I asked myself that question?
Former Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner shared a similar sentiment with me when we spoke about the search for Sheree.
You hate to miss it. And there's been cases where I've worked and I've missed things, and then you go back, and when you realize what you missed, it's like, dang, we'll make that mistake again.
Do you think this case is solvable?
I think it's a long shot, but I hate to say it's not. I think there's a chance.
What would solving it look like? Is it just getting the answer? Is it getting a conviction? Is it finding a body?
Well, my opinion on that would be, I think it's solvable But an effective prosecution, I think, would be extremely difficult at this point in time.
We might someday get a definitive answer to the question, what happened to Sheree Warren? But the window of opportunity to hold anyone accountable is rapidly closing. Consider what might happen if a prosecutor were to try and charge Cary Hartman with murder today based on the current evidence. They would first have to clear the hurdle of convincing a judge probable cause existed to believe Cary committed the crime. The circumstantial evidence we've uncovered in this podcast likely achieves that, but it's not likely to meet the higher standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt required for a criminal conviction. In the U.S. justice system, the accused are presumed innocent unless and until they are proven guilty. It's up to the prosecution to present that proof. It doesn't have to be absolute proof, but it must be enough to convince a judge or jury no other reasonable explanation exists. Apply that standard to what we know of Sheree Warren's disappearance. Could a serial killer have abducted Sheree off the streets of Salt Lake City? Unlikely, but not impossible. That's doubt, but maybe not reasonable doubt. Could Chuck Warren have killed Sheree in anger over their stalled divorce? Maybe he set up their meeting at Wagstaff Toyota as part of a plot. That's doubt, and it's reasonable, given what we know about how Chuck attacked his first wife with a tire iron during their divorce. Convincing a judge or jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, Chuck Warren or Cary Hartman killed Sheree would require more than just a good theory. It would take hard proof. Investigator Shane Miner spent years trying to find that proof.
I'm not going to ask you to say a name, but do you feel like you know who was responsible in this case?
I think so. I think there's one person who knows exactly what happened. And I don't think that person's going to admit to it. Maybe on his dying deathbed, but I doubt it.
I don't think Shane was talking about Chuck Warren. Sheree's ex-husband, Charles Chuck Warren, died on October 22, 2022, as a result of his dementia. Chuck had lived most of his life in Ogden, aside from a brief stint in Roseville, California during the 70s, working for the railroad. He had one brother, Richard, but they hadn't been close for much of Chuck's life. They only reconciled in Chuck's later years. Richard told me Chuck had been a car nut, whose favorite pastime had been taking long road trips all across the American West. Chuck Warren's death occurred very late in the reporting process for this podcast. It underscored to me, Sheree Warren's case runs a very real risk of soon becoming unsolvable. Earlier in this episode, you heard Sheree's dad, Ed Sorensen, say he didn't think he would ever know the truth of what happened to his daughter. Ed was right. He passed away in December of 2021.
People involved in the case are passing away. That's happening.
That's again the voice of Roy Police Detective John Frawley.
So, yes, the clock is ticking. Absolutely.
At the time I'm recording this, Kerry Hartman is still alive. He is the last man standing, and the evidence suggests Kerry has never been fully forthcoming about his actions during the days surrounding Sheree Warren's disappearance. Detective John Frawley told me he's not giving up, but he needs our help.
If someone interacted with Sheree Warren, Cary Hartman, or Charles Warren on October 2nd, 1985, and maybe they haven't spoken to law enforcement, I would love to speak to them. Our ultimate goal is, getting a case filed and prosecution.
My job as a journalist is a bit different than a detective's or a prosecutor's or a judge's. I'm not trying to make an arrest, to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, or to decide guilt or innocence under the law. My role is to uncover and report truth. So as we bring our story to a close, allow me to share the truth I have found while investigating Sheree Warren's case. As I speak to you now, I'm looking at a picture of Sheree from 1970 or so, when she was about 10 years old. Sheree is staring into the camera lens. I see youthful curiosity and determination in her eyes. Sheree's life held so much potential. She grew up and was just finding her own path when someone stole that life from her. I've had a few people say to me, "Boy, Sheree sure knew how to pick 'em," or "She sure had poor taste in men," as if her murder was somehow her own fault. We have to stop doing that. Stop putting the blame on women when they are lied to, manipulated, or abused by the people who are supposed to love them. More than half of the women who die by homicide in the United States each year are killed by a man who is either their current or past intimate partner. Sheree had both a current partner and a past partner who became plausible suspects in her death. So I can't tell you who killed Sheree, but I can say she is not responsible for the heartless actions of the two men in her life. Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, should have shown a bare minimum of human concern about her welfare. But he didn't. He acted as if her disappearance came as a favor. Sheree's short-term boyfriend, Cary Hartmann, role-played the part of a respectable man while steering the investigation away from himself and terrorizing an entire community of unsuspecting women. We can only imagine what he subjected Sheree to during their brief time together. Abuse in relationships doesn't always lead to murder, but there are stories like Sheree's where everything escalates until there is no coming back. We have to do better than this. That is my truth. If you have experienced abuse or sexual violence, you are not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Thank you for listening.